The late 60s and the early 70s, I was a scrawny kid in grade school and junior high in the big suburb of Pleasant Hill, Iowa, just outside the east edge of Des Moines. And we had a couple baseball coaches by the name of Todd and Jerry. Todd was tall and lanky. His son was on the team. Jerry was short and stocky and built like a tank. And Todd would strip off his shirt on a Saturday afternoon and pitch until we got weary of swinging the bat. And Jerry wasn't quite so athletic. He was a mechanic for semi-trucks. So they pull in off the interstates up here off of 2nd Avenue, and he'd slide his belly under it and work on heavy heated engines every day of the year and when he worked. And Jerry was pretty rough. And we would go to practice. The first couple of years were new, but the team began to develop, and for 4 or 5 years I was on their team, and they said, we're the winners team. And if you want to be on the team, you can, but you have to understand the rules. The first one is no swimming on game day. Well, that's a bad deal. And then they said, we're going to run lots of laps, so that's a bad deal. And we're going to have lots of batting practice, so that's a bad deal. But if you join our team, you're going to be on the winners team. And what we found out across 5 or 6 years of those late grade school, junior high years is they were serious. And I mean, it was a bad deal if you got called out on a strike that you didn't swing on. And we'd be out in the field, and Jerry would say from the diet, get down, boys, get down. And that meant get your rump down, and he didn't use the word rump. It meant get down with your hands on your knees and be ready and be looking. And then Todd, the other coach, would say, chatter, boys, chatter. And that means, hey, better, 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 hey, better, better. And that was life on our baseball team. A few years ago, I threw all those trophies away, but I haven't forgotten what it meant to be part of the winners team. They said, we may not always win, but you boys are on the winners team. And a few years ago, Jerry's daughter called me and said, Mom wanted me to call you and tell you Dad passed away. And I want, on behalf of our family, Dave, I want you to come and speak at Dad's funeral. Would you come meet with us? And I said yes. And when I knew Jerry, he was rough. He knew a lot more cuss words than he knew Bible words. But when we went to the funeral, they put me up early in the service. They said, just tell about growing up and playing baseball and being 2 doors down from Jerry. And so I did. And I told them some of the things I just told you. And then the associate pastor got up and preached the sermon. He described a Jerry I never met. You see, when I lived 2 doors down from Jerry, he was rough and tough and cussed a lot and really heavy duty. But somewhere somebody told him about Jesus, and he found the Lord and gotten saved and died a Christian and went to heaven. And I said to the associate pastor, I said, I never met the Jerry that you described today. He says, good thing you came today, Dave, because I never knew the man you described. And I looked in Jerry's casket before they closed it, and I said to myself, thanks, Jerry, for teaching me how to be part of the winners team. And I'm glad that he found out what it was to be a Christian. Well, several years ago, Josh McDowell, who is a Christian author, and Paul Lewis wrote a book entitled Givers, Takers, and Other Kinds of Lovers. And they present the clear reasons why God's plan for love and marriage and sex work best. Aren't you glad I'm not going there today? But if I could take the play on their book title and play with words, I might suggest today that the thoughts that we're going to present to you could be called givers, takers, and other kinds of keepers. You see, Proverbs 11, which is where we're camping today, just for one verse for a few minutes, has these 3 verses. Solomon, in his wisdom, wrote these 3 verses in Proverbs 11, and let me read them to you from the NIV. It says something like this: the desire of the righteous only ends in good, but the hope of the wicked only in wrath. One man gives freely, yet gains even more. The idea is if you give, you get more. That's what it says. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty. A generous man will prosper, and he who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. People curse the man who hoards grain, but blessing crowns him who's willing to sell. It's verse 25 I want to zero in on today. Several weeks ago, Pastor called and said, I'm going to be on vacation. I want you to fill in. And in keeping with focusing the future with God that he's been preaching about, and the idea that we need to be giving people, he asked me to speak in regards to that. And I'm going to tell a couple stories that a couple of you have heard before, but this message is new. I never really studied this passage, but in the notes, and Larry, do you have any notes left? Anybody need notes? I think we got them spread around. And there's 4 versions to this little 11:25 proverb verse. The first one is from the old King James Version. And it says, the liberal soul shall be made fat, and he that watereth shall be watered also himself. Now you have to understand, in the Hebrew concept, that leanness meant that you were doing without, and fatness was a metaphor for you're doing real good. And the Hebrew lends itself, actually, this translation of the part B of the verse. It says, if you water somebody else or something else, if you give a resource away, God will send a resource to you. That's the King James. Let's look at the New King James. A generous man will be made rich, and he who waters will also be watered himself. And then the Message, a little more contemporary. The one who blesses others is abundantly blessed. Those who help others are helped. And I personally like the NIV here, and that's what I'm preaching from this morning. A generous man will prosper. He who refreshes others will also be refreshed. What are we talking about giving? Well, you can give friendship, helpfulness, time, money, thought, counsel. You can give a lot of things away. We're not just talking about money today. It's not a money sermon. It's a giving message. Who do we give to? Well, there's always needy people. Give to the young. Give to the fragile, the beaten down, the lonely people. They're everywhere around us. We always have the option to give. What's the result? And if you don't write anything else down, you ought to write this down today. This is good, even though it's not mine. The result of being a giver, number 1, is the smile of God. You know something we really ought to be hungry for? It's the smile of God. And the smile of God will not always come to you with the approval of people. But this scriptural principle that has to do with sowing and reaping is sown into the fabric of the universe. And God put it in Proverbs 11:25 so that you could hear it today in a fresh way and apply it to your life. And if you do apply it to your life, it will change your life, because if you refresh somebody else, if you give somebody else, this scripture says God will give to you. The smile of God's the result. And then the second result of being a giving person is the gratitude of those that you choose to help. And the third one, it could almost be described as a selfish reason for giving, is your own spiritual enlargement. And who among us does not need to grow spiritually. Solomon was razor sharp. He was right on, and I won't take time to read all the quotes that are in the notes, but there's a couple here I want to lift out. The right below where you're writing in your notes, he's the richest man in the esteem of the world who's gotten most. F.B. Meyer says, but he is the richest in the esteem of heaven who has given the most. Again, we're not talking about money. I'm not asking you for a large sum of money today. I'm appealing to you to be part of the winner's team. And the winner's team, according to the book of God, is a person that has a generous heart, that's willing to give of what they have to refresh other people. Have you ran into anybody that needs to be encouraged recently? Charles Spurgeon, the great preacher, said, if I carefully consider others, God will consider me, and in some way or another will recompense me. Meyer, the preacher, says, set no limit on your gifts, time, money, energy, and the act of giving the whole that you've expended. God will return to you and more also. The life in the Spirit Bible says when God supplies in abundance, it is so that we may multiply our good works. If God's blessed you with an abundance of time, of resources, of talent, of something that you can share and refresh somebody, if you'll give it away, the promise of God is He'll come and bless your life. I like what our deceased brother, Dr. Stan Toller, one of our general superintendents, said some years ago. He said, Jesus can't bless what we hold on to selfishly. He can bless only that which we give up to Him. Wow. I'll let you read the rest of the quotes, but I want to give you a few bullet points here of what happens when we refresh others. We refresh others when we give them information which empowers them to learn. I'm trying to model that today by giving you some new good information. Several years ago on a Sunday night, when we were still having Sunday night services, I preached in one of our churches. As I was leaving the building after a great Sunday night service, the man at the door shook my hand. And when I went to shake his hand, he didn't let go. And he said, Pastor Dave, you don't recognize me, do you? I don't like that feeling. When they know you and you don't know them. Do you know what I'm talking about? I held on to his hand because he wouldn't let go, and I looked him in the eye. I said, I'm sorry, I don't know who you are. He said, I'm Tim. And we went to your church, Ed, and he named the church that he had attended that I pastored 25 years prior. I said, Tim. He let go of my hand, and I looked at him. He'd had a rough life, but God had cleaned him up. He looked so different, I didn't even recognize him. He named his wife, and he said, she's gone to heaven. But he said, I want to thank you. You changed my life. And he got out. He started to reach for his billfold. That always scares me, too. He reached that billfold, and he began to open his billfold, and he said, I want to thank you for changing my life. He pulled out a little business card, and it had a hole in the middle of it with a dime and a heavy-duty piece of transparent tape over the dime. At the top of the card, it said, putting God first. He said, I don't know if you remember, but you passed these out one Sunday morning. And I carried this little card in my billfold for 25 years. And when my wife died, she had it in her purse, and hers was better, so I threw mine away. This is my wife's card. I've carried my card or my wife's card for 25 years. You preached this sermon, Pastor Dave, and it changed our life forever. I don't even remember what I preached about that night. But I want to tell you, that brother encouraged me And I refreshed him simply because I gave him some good information. We refresh others when we supply a need to their lives. I remember several years ago we were leaving one pastorate, going to another, and we owned our own home, and this couple in our church, Tony and Joanne, they loved us and we loved them and still are friends. And I remember, I don't know how long it's been since you moved, but everybody needs to move once in a while, get rid of some clutter. And I remember when we moved from that place to the next place, I remember how Tony and Joanne showed up early on moving day. And they left about 11:15 that night because Tony insisted that we pull out the stove and refrigerator. Do you know what lives under your stove and refrigerator? Not stuff I want to camp with. Tony got down on his hands and knees and cleaned it all. They vacuumed every closet and they wiped out under the kitchen sink another grody area. They refreshed us. And when we pulled away at almost midnight, we said, what would we have done if they wouldn't have come and given that to us? What a precious gift. You refresh other people when you supply a need in their lives. And then there was Margaret. Some of you met Margaret Dayhoff, a retired missionary now gone to heaven, Africa, 40 years. She was in our church a few years ago. And for the 8.5 years I was her pastor, if Margaret was there and I was there, which most of the 8.5 years we were, a few Sundays they were gone, we were gone. But if she was there and I was there was never, hardly ever a Sunday before she left that she didn't come say, great music today, Pastor. Our class is a wonderful Sunday school class. It was a great message today, Pastor Dave. She always had something to refresh me by, to refresh me with. She was just a thankful person. And when you refresh other people, it's a great blessing. We were in a building program at one particular church, and I went to Rotary on Tuesdays at noon, and the secretary buzzed me at 11:45, and she said, Sally's here to see you, Pastor Dave. I said, I'm leaving in 5 minutes to go to Rotary. She said, Sally says all she wants is 5 minutes. I said, send her in. Sally's in her late 80s, her and her husband, and she said, Pastor Dave, Sunday was great. This was on a Tuesday at 11:45. She said, Sunday was a great day. Herb and I got home and we had Sunday dinner and we were sitting there talking about how great our church is and all that God's doing and blessing. And she said, Herb, my husband, looked across. He said, honey, don't we have a CD coming up this week? She said, well, we do. He said, I think it's $10,000. He said, what are we going to do with that money? She said, Pastor Dave, and I'm sitting at my desk, behind the desk, and she's standing right in front of me. She said, after talking about the goodness of God and what he's doing, we just felt like God wanted us to give $10,000 to the church. And I'm here today, Pastor Dave, to write $10,000. And she flipped open her checkbook, wrote out $10,000. I couldn't hardly stay seated. I wanted to jump across the desk and hug her. Every pastor like a visitor like that, doesn't matter what time it is. And she wrote a check for $10,000 to First Church of the Nazarene, signed her name and said, we're blessed. And she gave me the check and she said, bye, Pastor. Have a good Rotary meeting. I don't remember what Rotary was about. It was the best meeting I ever went to. And it had nothing to do with the food or the speaker. Now, you think I'm telling that story because the church got $10,000. We're just trying to raise $1.5 million. Our pastors presented a need for us for $44,000. Maybe somebody here today or somebody listening by live stream or who listened down the road. It may not be $10,000, but God will tell you to do something like he told them. The joy of this story is I was refreshed, not because the church got $10,000. I was refreshed in my spirit because somebody that I'd learned to love and that learned to love me and my family, and we were in the same church, I was refreshed because they obeyed God. And we ought always to be refreshed when somebody in our midst obeys God. I remember at one church I had a bad board meeting. I was going through the numbers this morning. I've had about 300 board meetings. And you know, there's about 3 or 4 that are really good. And there's 3 or 4 I don't want to talk about. It was after one of those 3 or 4, one of the worst board meetings I've had out of 300. It was just ugly. Nobody was encouraged, and people weren't very nice to each other. Somebody wasn't very nice to me, and I didn't sleep all night, and I felt like not going to the office. I showed up at the office next morning about 8:15. About 9 o'clock, the secretary buzzed, said, so-and-so's here, and if I told the man's name, he's a prominent leader in our church. He happened to be in our community. She didn't know who he was, and I said, send him in. He walked in my office, and he said, Dave, I couldn't leave this town without stopping in to see how our Nazarene pastor was. He said, how are you? Wrong question. I was about as low as a pastor could be the morning after a bad board meeting. And for the next hour and 20 minutes, this man who was 10 years my senior told me the worst and most horrible things he'd experienced in all of his ministry. Then he scooted his chair over and held out his hands and said, let me pray for you. You're going to be all right, son. The sun's going to shine tomorrow, and the church is going to be just fine. And maybe something I've said or shared today will encourage and refresh you. Woo! I could go a long time when somebody pours out a transparent heart and refreshes you like that. And I'm telling you, church, there's people everywhere. You don't have to be a pastor. There's people everywhere that need our encouragement and refreshing. This is one of my favorites. A couple more stories, and we got to wind this message down. Pastor Richard read some of the supportive scriptures already, so I'm not reading those. You can read some of the comments and commentaries I put there, but I wanted to share these stories because I think you can identify with them. I like iced tea. Right over there. I brought my Mid-American Nazarene glass today. But I have a fast food establishment I regularly patronize, which shall remain unnamed today, not too far from here. And I go through there 3 or 4 times a week, and I get a half sweet tea. And one day I said I want a large iced tea, half cut, with no ice. See, I bring my own ice. Tea goes farther, you get it? Some of you will catch it later on. And I pulled up to the window, and the little gal who I can't believe is more than 19, I think she's 16 or 17, said, I knew it was you. And I looked at her and I said, how do you know it was me? She said, I know your voice. You changed my life. And I looked in my rearview mirror to check and make sure nobody was behind me. And I looked at her and I thought, I don't know who you are. I said, how do you remember me? She said, you changed my life. I just started here 3 weeks ago. And the first week I was on the job, you came through and said, large iced tea, half cut, no ice. And when you got to this window and you gave me your $2 and I gave you 93 cents back, she said, you said, you have a great smile and you're doing a really good job. I'm going to recommend that your boss give you a raise. I said that? She said, oh yeah. Nobody ever told me anything so affirming before, and it's changed my life. See you next time, buddy. And so periodically when I go through there and order a large iced tea, half cut with no ice, she said, got you covered, buddy. And I'm telling you, there are people everywhere that something simple like a compliment will refresh them, and it could change their life forever. The last one is, that's when we give something to somebody. The last one is when we add value to their lives. My wife and I are friends with a couple. They're 20 years our senior. They're good Nazarene people. They've served Jesus for a long time. And we get with them pretty frequently. Not selfishly, because we try and be reciprocal. But they continually add value to our lives. They care about our kids. And my friend Bill likes to golf. And my kids live in Kansas City. My son likes to golf. My daughter likes to golf. And Bill and his wife called a couple of years, 3 or 4 years ago, and said, hey, can you guys get away for a couple of days? Go on a trip with us? We said, where are we going? He said, we're going to Kansas City. We said, well, we don't need to go to Kansas City. We're there all the time. He said, no, we want to go to Kansas City and golf with your kids. Let me get this right. I'm 25 years older than my kids. They're 20 years older than me. They're 45 years older. And they'll take a couple days and pay their own way. Go spend time with my kids. I will tell you, that's refreshing. I want to grow into being that kind of person. So this whole idea of refreshing others, it's powerful. And I know some of you have heard me tell this story before, but I want to tell it again today. When I was back there in junior high, I had a distant cousin who lived in Alaska. My mom and I decided to go visit them one summer. We flew to Fairbanks, and from Fairbanks, where our cousin lived, he was a medical doctor in the service, we went to Point Barrow, the furthest point north on the northern continent, and saw the whales in the sea there, did all the Eskimo stuff. And then we flew over to Prudhoe Bay. And back in the early 70s, that was the beginning of the Alaskan pipeline. And there in Prudhoe Bay in the northern tundra of Alaska in the early 70s, we saw from the airplane and on the ground several stockpiles of huge pipe. The pipe were 100 foot long, and they were about 4 foot high. I was 13 or 14. All wet, I weighed 140 pounds and wasn't quite 6 foot high, but I was a good 1.5 feet taller than a 4 foot pipe. When we got back to Fairbanks, we went to Valdez. That happens to be the end of the Alaskan pipeline. And the same thing, they had stockyards where there was hundreds of 100-foot-long pipes that were 4 foot high. And periodically, you'd see a place you could stop, and they had one laid out, and you could look and take pictures. And as a 13 or 14-year-old kid, I stooped down on one end of that pipe and went all 100 feet until I got to the other end. And I'll tell you, when you're in the middle at 50 foot looking each way, it seems like that pipe's a mile long. And I realized in 1973, in the middle of that pipe, someday, oil's going to flow through here. It's going to go from Prudhoe Bay and the northern tundra of Alaska to the great fishing port of Valdez, where the Exxon oil spill happened several years later. It snaked its way down in 100-foot sections. And from northern Alaska, and it's been happening for several decades now, that oil will flow through those pipes. I wasn't a Christian then. I became a Christian a couple years later. And 5 or 6 years after I became a Christian, I was at a church camp, and The words to the chorus that the man sang are on your notes there. He said, I want you to learn this chorus, and the worship team's going to come and lead us here in a minute in it. And the name of the chorus is Let Your Love Flow Through Me. I said I'd been a Christian for 5 years, and if you're a Christian today, you're part of the greatest team in all the world, God's church. But you know, I know a lot of Christians who, when it boils right down to the bare minimum, are pretty selfish. It's more about keeping and protecting me than it is about giving and blessing you. You know what I mean? Do you know anybody like that? And the day in church camp that I heard the Canadian man named Dwight Mullins sing this chorus, I went from being just part of the church who knew he was going to heaven to taking a step up with God and saying, I want to not just talk this way, I want to live this way. I don't want to be a taker. I don't want to be a keeper. I didn't even know the verse then, and in all these years of ministry, I've never preached on it. But in the last 6-7 weeks, I spent a lot of time with Proverbs 11, and I'm trying to understand and unwrap the nuances of a generous person will prosper, will be blessed, will be made touched by God. And if you choose to take whatever God's given you, attitude, money, time, talent, if you'll do more than hoard it to yourself, which verse 26 talks about, that's a bad way to live. But if you develop the discipline of giving something away to help somebody else, this is as close to the prosperity gospel as you can get, folks. I'm telling you, God says He will refresh you in like manner. That's not Nazarene. That's not Dave. That's the word of the Lord. And this simple chorus says, look at the words if you have the notes. Let your love flow through me. Let your love flow through me. Make me, Lord, a blessing wherever I may be. Keep me pure. Keep me clean so that you can be seen. It's not about writing a $10,000 check. It's not about complimenting a McDonald's host. It's not about wiping under somebody's refrigerator or stove when they move. It's about having the kind of heart that's so filled with God that you realize He pours into you so He can pour out of you and reveal His character to a lost and dying world. I don't want to just talk about that. I don't want to sing about that. I want to be the kind of person who lives that way. And there's not one among us today, either in this hotel meeting room or watching live stream or later in another method or manner. There's not one among us who couldn't step up a notch, a step, in our willingness to give away and refresh others so that you, Lord, may be seen. Let your love flow through me. Worship team, would you just sing it a couple times? You can join in as they sing. It may take you a time or two to catch the tune, but it's a powerful chorus, and we're going to pray it at the end in a few moments. Let's hear it as we worship together.